Hello, and welcome to the final episode of A Moment in Time History Podcast. I am your host, Felina Frazier. I hope you have enjoyed this series as much as I have. It has been interesting looking back at history as an adult. When I was in grade school, history classes were part of the curriculum, and I feel like I had a good understanding of the history of the nation, but that was so long ago. It was nice to get a refresher and also learn new things in the process of doing this podcast. I hope you were able to learn new information as well. With that being said, let's hop into the topic of today. What were the social causes of the Civil War? The social causes of the Civil War consisted of the conflicting views on slavery by the Southerners and the Northerners that created a divide in these states. In a review by author John Du Bois, quote, "The slave states had demonstrated their ability to preserve the government. The free states were in a condition to open revolution against the government," end quote. Southerners were pro-slavery and wanted it to last forever. They had built wealth for many centuries on the backs of slaves. They were the hub for some of the most lucrative goods in the United States. Without slavery, Southerners would not be as powerful as they were at the time. They wanted to expand slavery to the West, but Northerners wanted more freed states. Northerners were anti-slavery and thought that slavery was taking away opportunities for poor white Americans. Slavery changed the economy and made it harder for the less than wealthy to thrive. Northerners fought against slavery and freed slaves willingly. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, the Confederate States did not like what his goals were for the political party and his views on slavery. Lincoln was for the Republican Party. He was determined to make a change in the nation. He was the president of the Union. States of the Union were northern and western free states. That consisted of states like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Ohio, Kansas, Nevada, and California, and so on. In the South, Jefferson Davis was the elected president of the Confederate States, such as Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and so on. It is a misconception that the main cause of the Civil War was to end slavery. In fact, both regions had different views on the economy, government policies, and of course, all of this revolved around slavery, but slavery was to free slaves was not the cause. According to the American Yawp, quote, on April 12, 1861, Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard fired on the Fort Anderson, surrendered on April 13th, and the Union troops evacuated. In response to the attack, President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve 3 months to suppress rebellion. The American Civil War began, end quote. It was the South that initiated the Civil War. Freed black men and runaway slaves from the South joined the Union Army and Navy. They fought alongside white men. In the South, they continued to encourage white non-slave holders to become slave owners. From the point of view of James DuBois, quote, "The non-slaveholder of the South preserves the status of the white man. and is not regarded as inferior or dependent. He is not told that the Declaration of Independence, when it says that all men were born free and equal, refers to the Negro equally with himself, end quote. If you were a non-slaveholder in the South, you were viewed as a slave yourself. It was almost mandatory to be a white man and own slaves. Southerners were not going to back down when it came to slavery. They wanted to stay separate from the rest of the United States. Their goals were pro-slavery, white supremacy, and white liberty. Abraham Lincoln threatened all of what the South stood for. According to the book Slave as a Cause of Civil War, quote, Southern thought must justify the slave principle, justify slave as natural, normal, and necessary. He who justifies mere Negro slave does not think at all. To prove that such men so not think at all, we have only to recur to the fact that they have always cited the usages of antiquity and the commands of the Bible to prove that Negro slavery is right, end quote. Southerners saw nothing wrong with slavery because they believed it was in the Bible and that this is just the way the nation was supposed to be. The Civil War lasted for 4 years. Many soldiers on both sides lost their lives in the war. By the third year, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a strategic plan to win the war. The purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to free all slaves in the states that were pro-slavery. As mentioned earlier, the Civil War was not started because they were fighting solely for the freedom of slaves, although that was one of the social causes. It was later in the war that slavery was to be legally void. 1 year after the Emancipation Proclamation was created, the Civil War was over. As stated by Arthur Ida Tarbell, quote, how completely the conflict was at an end, the people of the North had not realized until they read the paper. The order of the Secretary of War suspending the draft, stopping the purchase of military supplies, and removing military restrictions, end quote. In conclusion, the social causes of the Civil War were stemmed around slavery. The Union was anti-slavery, and the Confederates were pro-slavery. The ending of slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, but social causes such as all states becoming free and independent, and how the economy would be affected if there was no slavery, and how the government would be affected. This all created a divide in the nation, which led to the war and eventually the abolishment of slavery. I hope you enjoyed the final episode of A Moment in Time History Podcast. Once again, I am your host, Philana Frazier, and I will leave you with a quote from the late novelist Michael Crichton. Quote, if you don't know your history, then you don't know anything. End quote.